Right, ready for part two. This is a second presentation on extending your DITA-OT plugins. It's all about using cloud services. I'm only going to show two plugins for this particular section, but the point here is that if you want to extend your plugins beyond a certain point, you're probably better off using somebody else's services. They've probably done something in this area already. So rather than build everything from scratch and use JavaScript, what we can do is we can get hold of a service which someone provides. You might have to pay for it, and then do all the processing elsewhere. Just as an example, I'll show this. This is a text-to-speech plugin. I'll show you the result first, and we'll work backwards. So that's that one there. And if you remember, I created a PDF earlier, which was talking about this Prism thing. The plugin we have here, which is here, where are we? Got it. Is basic usage.
Basic usage. You need to include the prism.css and prism.js authoring files you downloaded in your page. Example. Prism does its best to encourage good practices. Therefore, it only works with code elements, since marking up code without a code element is semantically invalid. According to the HTML5 spec.
As you can see, the text-to-speech is working in that it's giving you an audio for the... I'll stop that for a second. As you can see, the result is an audio book showing what is actually what would be coming out in your PDF or HTML. In other words, it's a completely new output format. And how we go about this, well, that's what the rest of this talk is going to be about. Close that. Text-to-speech. If you working backwards, speech is going to be some sort of either MP3 or MP4A file. So we need to have that as our output format. So in order to generate that, you need to have a format called SSML, which is Speech Synthesis Markup Language, which can then be passed to a web service. There's one by IBM, there's one by Microsoft, there's one by Google, whatever. So which can then read this and then come up with a voice in various accents and various languages. So those, obviously the additional bits. And then it is possible you might want to concatenate all of these files into one great big long file. So working backwards, you've got your audiobook, which is then MP3, and in order to concatenate, you can use another tool called ffmpeg, and equally you've got DITA to SSML, which then goes to this web service. So you can see there are various different stages to this, and it is necessary to be able to come up with an output for each particular section. Obviously, there is no need to be fixed to one particular service, so it is possible to switch the different services, saying if you've got a parameter set or not set. I'll move on to the code now, actually, first. Let's have a look at some of the code. As usual, I've got the ant targets at the bottom, and as you saw in the previous slide, there are these three potential outputs. So there are, funny enough, three targets, which you could also see in the plugin. They've got this MP3, SSML, and audiobook, and therefore they all have in the build file DITA-to SSML, DITA-to MP3, and DITA-to audiobook. This is a standard transform which is working on the processed DITA files. So therefore it goes through the initial build init, there is a certain amount of setting up of making sure you've got your services and making sure that they can connect before we go through standard pre-process or pre-process 2, which means that we've now got all the key refs and definitions and what have you into some intermediate files, which means we can then go through and render the SSML or audiobook. You can think about that. You could actually go direct to MP3 or direct to audiobook, but the first thing to do is to just try and get out this format as SSML, which, as you would probably expect, is just purely a matter of a series of XSLT transforms. The reason why this is XSLT heavy. If we have a look at the relevant piece of XSL, I'm just looking through the various elements to find those which, like such as P, the P element, or PH for the span type elements, to see what is likely to be text. Obviously, as I wouldn't get a computer to read out, say, a code block, or for that matter, images are irrelevant. So there's a match and return to blank for all sorts of things as well. Furthermore, there is an ability to do various things like emphasis or changing the pattern, which since these are not elements within the standard DITA specification, they need to be retrieved from another attribute. Now, there are several attributes in the DITA spec which are common to virtually everything, and obviously you think something like output class is going to change how it's rendered, but there's two places you could potentially add this stuff. This is either going to go into the props attribute or the other props attribute. Now, I assume that these are actually properties of the actual thing rather than metadata to do with it. So therefore, I've chosen to override props, which is now looking for elements such as emphasis or voice or say as, which are all part of the SSML standard, things like phoneme. Now, as you'd probably expect from any standard, various manufacturers do not agree on how this should be done. So there are also a couple of speciality bits which might just work for IBM Watson or might just work for Microsoft Azure or what have you. So it is possible to come up with something which doesn't necessarily go the way you would expect. Okay, let's try building an SSML file. Beyond that is just looking into the topic. It will attempt to find things like the language attribute, because obviously the language which is spoken is important, and also particularly for files which end up being speech or chapters, there is a need to look at the metadata as well, because the metadata is important, because that gives you things like the title of the file. If I just go back to my little iTunes thing, it's saying it's looking for basic usage, and it's got it's called the Prism JS plugin, because if you look at the actual DITA, there's metadata either in the DITA map itself or in some cases in the file, which would give you the various bits of information. Now, if I go back and look at the output from that particular one, I won't run all the different things here, but at least I should be able to see something coming through here. So here, basic usage SSML, with, say, text editor. And you can see it looks pretty much actually like the raw DITA, actually, apart from the fact that it's got the metadata at the top, your standard method like part of and what have you, and it's got every P element just as P, so it's stripped out a lot of stuff. It also it is possible to have slightly different speech patterns when you're doing things like lists by getting it to pause, but that's basically all that does. So having got an output like this SSML, it is then a matter of iterating through the files, which of course would be through the different transforms. So this will then be into the where are we? Go back this. Going back to the MP3 rendering, where what we would need to do is to take this, get hold of a topic list from the DITA map itself, because this is something that's going to be useful for iterating, and then process each one of the individual files using this SSMP3 function. This is a macro def, which is in my my ant lib, which is then means I can keep my ant quite clean. So it is an iterator, and we know that it is perfectly possible to do iterations using JavaScript. It's just reading this list of files and then saying for each one of these files, process it in turn. And obviously, if I've already got a copy, then I don't need to do too much. So let's have a look at what that does. So we iterate, and then that will call the JavaScript, which will then run a transform to audio. Each file goes in turn, and it needs to work out what voice I'm currently using, which I can get from reading a mixture of the configuration files using XSL and the information which can be found in the file itself, what language we're supposed to be using. And then this is the get voice transform here. But we also need to get hold of the metadata to be used for things elsewhere. And then we need to call this text-to-speech services, which will depend on which thing we're actually doing. I'll scroll down to that, which is here. Depends on which one you've got as to what you're doing. And if I take, say, this one here, I then am able to call a service using curl. Now, there is a get task in Ant, which is fine but rather simple. And there is also a post service in the Ant contrib. However, both of these are a little bit too simplistic. If you want to do things like you have to include a bearer token, for example, saying this is who I am, and therefore you will charge me for it for using your services. Having got that, I set the output property and the result property to check, is it actually processing? Because if you are using third-party services and it doesn't work, you need to be able to inform the user, hey, let's break out of this and say this really is an error. And I'll show some error handling later on. So say it's failed, and it will fail if Bing has failed in this particular case here. And of course, it will give you additional debug. This is a third-party service which will take the SSML and return an MP3, and of course it costs money to do so. So if we already have one of these files somewhere, we want to do things like copy the file from a cache, which once again is a case of using the file reader to see where we've got cached files and whether the MD5 hash matches, so we haven't updated it, and then just copy over rather than go and get something else. So you can see here, once again, we've got this idea of doing an ant task, a copy task, to get hold of files that are necessary. Now, we've now got a set of MP3s, and we've also got a set of metadata information. So this needs to be able to concatenate the files together. In order to concatenate the files together, it is a matter of using this tool called ffmpeg, which is able to take, this is just checking to see that it actually works, but it actually exists on my machine. It needs to be an executable. You can see task name ffmpeg. And then putting in the necessary attributes so that it will run. I'm trying to find the function. Where has it disappeared to? There's ffmpeg. Lost it. I'll probably put it in the other place, haven't I? Just a minute. Oh, it's probably in here, isn't it? Antlib, I'm looking at the wrong file. Oh, it's text. Those. Yeah, that's it. That's the one. Where is ffmpeg disappeared to? Add cover art. Trying to find it. Lost my file. Merge. Here we go. So we can do, yeah, okay. So when you are running a third-party service, in this case, ffmpeg is something which must be downloaded. As I said earlier, there are various choices. We've now used this web service. You can use the jar task if it's Java-based. However, more common is to use exec. Now, this method of using exec does not work on Windows because Windows needs a special format for how to fire things off. However, for either Mac-based systems or Linux-based systems, and of course you could Dockerize your examples that would work even on Windows with this. You just have to have the executable name and the series of parameters. The thing to be careful with here is making sure you get your slashes Unix style, because if you put your slashes in Windows style, in other words, instead of // it can cause issues. So it's going through each file, and then in this case it's just ff metadata, which is again a processed XSL file. Whoops. The final part of this, of course, is to concatenate everything together. Now, there is a peculiarity with audiobooks in that there are two formats for audiobooks, which is M4A and M4B. And one of them is proprietary to the Mac, which means that therefore means it's obviously easier to run this particular transform to get a valid output by using a Mac. If you do it on Unix, I believe you can get a file. I don't know if the file actually works, but it is perfectly possible to generate these files using a Mac and then run them on a Unix box thereafter. There's the thing gone. There we go. Okay, so what do we need to do here? Oh yes. There are, as I said, the executable there. JavaScript can also be used to ensure that we get the durations of various sections correct, because obviously when you're adding in multiple chapters, you end up having first from 0 to 44 seconds, and then 44 to 53 seconds, and so on and so forth. And it is possible using JavaScript to amend ANT properties. This is indeed what happens with the var tasks in and contrib, and it's literally just 2 lines. You just do project get property, project set property, which of course is very useful when you're trying to concatenate X to Y to Z and go through to the end. So yeah. The getting hold of the metadata again is very, very important, because there are a series of intermediate files I'm using here. I want to find out what's the title, what's the voice, and so on and so forth. And once we've got a simple file, you can then add that into this ffmpeg system to get hold of whatever else is necessary. The second service which I can show the results of is a language translation service. If you have documentation in English and you want to change it to, say, German, you can use another XML-based standard called XLiff. XLiff is there for as XML location interchange format, file format. and it defines how you need to build up your intermediate files plus a few unique numbers. I'll show the intermediate file first. XLiff create. Get another thing coming up. Now, this is a DITA, raw DITA to intermediate format thing. So it is necessary it doesn't go through the ordinary pre-processing. It doesn't need to go through the ordinary pre-processing. So it's a little bit different. Now, if I find out what that file has come through, that won't be there, it'll be in the other one. XLiff, there we go. You can see here that there's actually this is already pre-processed file. No, that's right. You can see here that for each element of my text, I have got the original stuff like the title, and I've got a target for the element, which is in this case I'm doing it into German, and each element needs to have a semi-unique ID. So this is just got blanks for the second half. Now, similarly, there is an SKL file which has got a series of let's find a topic; it's easier to look at. A series of placeholders in the topics, which means that it is this is where the text would go once we have translated. Now, this is the information which you would pass to your translator to ensure that the final value is correct. As you can see, things like the code block has not got a placeholder; it's just got in directly because it's not that sort of element. But this is my basic skeleton file, which is SKL. Now, if I go back again, what I should be able to do, fingers crossed, not that any of these demos have gone wrong ever, is that I should be able to run a translation service. Similarly, there is a web service which would be able to take text in the XLiff format, take the elements of each element of the text and translate them in turn. And this means that we are able to look at what is actually happening one item after another. Just wait for that to complete and we can see what's happened to our files. Hold on a minute there. It takes a little bit of time because it's got, obviously, every single element needs to go through and be processed. Now, if I open up that translate XLiff again, you can see things like you need to include the CSS Prism has been translated into Sie müssen die Prism CSS erstellen und so weiter und so weiter und so weiter. And you can see it's now written in both English and German, the German being the target language. One point which is to be noted here is that if you look at the targets have not been authorized, but it's saying yes, I don't want to translate absolutely everything yet. It's kind of almost there. Now, having got this information, it is then possible to obviously take these elements and put them into the skeleton files to come out with something else, which would be a translated set of DITA into German. Okay, so the first part has got one peculiarity, and that is that if I have a text snippet like example, and I want to get hold of the German translation, which is Beispiel, I could then translate it once, and I could fix it in all the places it needs to be. Because if every single title has every single title is example, every single title will be repeated. So XLiff demands that each one of these things, each of these translatable snippets has got a unique ID or semi-unique ID. Now there are several ways you could do this. You could do an MD5 hash, for example. However, it is simplest if we go into wrong tab. If we go into where are we? Translate XLiff. Here we go. XSL. It is simplest just to borrow some code from the internet, and of course make sure that you attribute it, to use something like the Fletcher checksum, which will give you a number which is based on a hash of the text itself, and it is generated within the XSL. So my XSL starts off with a nearly an identity transform. This is the identity transform here, but I am merely adding in one attribute, saying this is the approximate number I need to do. Having done that, I can do things like, say, wherever I find that attribute, put the placeholder. This is putting the placeholder text for that MD5, or I could place the XSL into this intermediate XLiff file. So I'm now doing my processing, my initial processing through XSL, and I am then passing on to a web service for the second part. The second part is going through the antlib, which again needs this iterator across the files, which once again this iterate file set is going to be a fairly standard function by now. And then for each one of the things we want to translate, we can decide which of our many resources we can do. You can use Bing, you can use DeepL, you can use Watson, you can use Yandex, whatever. Well, it doesn't really matter which transformer you do. You need to pass those files in. This is an example from IBM. You pass the files in using a post, which is the same as the last one, making sure you've got the right key. And then, of course, you need to read the response. Now, if you were listening to the information about the CATS API, you'll know that this is precisely the sort of thing you can use JavaScript for, to get hold of snippets of information direct from a JSON-based API. And if I take an example of, say, I don't know, Bing, you can see here we are reading an attribute, and then we're just using JSON parse to get hold of whatever the element of text is, and then we manipulate it as necessary. So the output is a snippet of translated text. Of course, when you finally get around to doing the create your DITA files, which is that one, yes. Once again, you need to where's the third part? Lost it. If you'd be going XLiff to DITA, once again, you need to use this translating targets, which means that you need to use this XML task to get hold of each translatable unit and place it into the output directory. If I now run that on the previously processed file, fingers crossed again, live demo, it should. Yeah, it's now telling me that none of my translation IDs have been approved for use, which is true because I have not used a proper translator. I've just used a mechanical translator, and it should be the case if I now go back to here and DITA translated, and I look at my topics, open with. You can see that my DITA has now got German text within it, which is means that it's properly translated, and therefore you could then go on and generate that as a PDF, an HTML, or what have you. There are, of course, several issues with this. You should not rely on a mechanical auto-translator. It is liable to get things wrong with context. My job title, I am the Senior Technical Evangelist at the Fireware Foundation, and I was recently translated into Arabic, and my mechanical Arabic translation was saying I was the mechanical proletizer of the word of God, word of the Lord Jesus Christ, into a mainly Muslim domain, is probably an incorrect translation, I would guess, or at least an insensitive translation. So whatever comes out of here is probably going to be incorrect, warning, which is why it does warn you that each element which has not got an approved yes attribute on it has not been checked by a native speaker. Similarly, there is if you are looking to translate texts, you should not overuse keyrefs. The best thing to do here actually would be to use the normalized DITA transform to get rid of them altogether. Because most languages, not English, but most other common languages, use word endings or word agreements, which means that if you have a specific word as an element, then it becomes very difficult to translate that, or rather expensive to translate that. So that briefly is our two services which can use the web to get hold of additional information and do all the clever stuff for you.